Today is day 21, and it marks the beginning of the second half of Lent. Somehow it feels different. Have you noticed the weather's changed? And Easter now seems visible on the horizon. It's exactly the same in the last 10 verses of John chapter 10. It marks a great turning point in the gospel. Things have changed. The weather's got very cold, and the Passover is just on the horizon. From verse 40, the whole focus of the book will change. It will change entirely to the road to Calvary that is now only 3 months away. And all this is against the background of the Feast of Hanukkah. The Feast of Hanukkah had arrived, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. It was winter. Now, what is the Feast of Hanukkah? It's the only Jewish feast that is not based on the Old Testament. It's based on an event that took place between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, exactly 160 years before Jesus was born. A dreadful man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes from Syria took over Israel and began a brutal persecution of the Jews. And many people died at that time. It was called the abomination of desolation. And then the Lord gave to the people of Israel the family of the Maccabee brothers. Maccabee means a hammer, and they were very tough people. This is the only image we have of Judas, the oldest brother, and you can see that he's a very fierce man. And they raised a rebellion and threw Antiochus out of Jerusalem. And the Maccabee brothers, the great protectors, gave the temple back to the priests, and they began the heartbreaking task of cleaning it up physically and ritually. The first thing they wanted to do was to relight the lamps of the Lord. That lamp represented the presence of God, and it had not been allowed to go out for 400 years, day or night. But it's an oil lamp, and they didn't have any oil. And then they found a tiny cruse of oil for 1 day's burning. But it takes 8 days to prepare new oil. Nevertheless, they lit the lamps, and those lamps burned for 8 days. It's forever been considered a miracle by the Jewish people. And so they instituted the festival of Hanukkah in middle of December. Hanukkah means dedication. In your Bible, you'll probably find it called the Feast of Dedication. And then he makes his final statement about his own divinity. He's been doing this for chapter after chapter, and the Jews have known exactly what he's been doing. They tried to stone him for it a few times. And here he comes with the greatest, most unequivocal of all: I and the Father are one. And they immediately pick up stones to stone him for blasphemy. And they were right. He was claiming to be God. And it was blasphemy unless he was who he says he was. And just like that, that's the last thing Jesus says to the Pharisees. Even when they call him back 3.5 months later on trial for his life, he won't say a word to them. He's done with them. And so we reach the great turning point of the book of John in verse 40. Then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing. He's turning his back on the Pharisees, never to focus on them again. The Feast of Tabernacles took place in late September. That was back in chapter 7. The Feast of Dedication we've just seen is in the middle of December. And then Jesus goes down to the Jordan, and he stays there 3.5 months until the Feast of Passover in April. And John tells us nothing at all about what happens in those 3.5 months. Between the end of chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11, 3.5 months pass. What is Jesus doing during those 3.5 months? I believe he's on sabbatical. He's gone away from the cold and the conflict and the tension. And for these 3.5 months, he's building up his strength for the conflict that is to come. And so if I were making a movie of the book of John, I'd make it a great epic like Ben-Hur. And I'd make it long so that you had to have an intermission in the middle. And I would set the intermission at verse 40. And my last scene before intermission would be Jesus walking down that dusty, tortuous, mountainous road called the Road of Death to Jericho. And then I would bring on the sign intermission. I would be saying, go ahead, get your cup of coffee, buy your popcorn. Because when you come back, half of the Gospel of John will deal with the passion of the Christ.